The opposition said on Sky News this morning, you can't argue with the numbers. You can't argue with the numbers. Well, he's argued with the numbers and he's come off second best, just as he might argue with the numbers and come off second best in the Liberal Party room in a couple of months, I suspect, Madam Deputy Speaker. But we've also had, of course, the official opposition response last night, the Shadow Treasurer's press release. 2 pages. I thought, oh, this will be good. 2 pages, obviously a considered release, obviously a position for which a great deal of thought has gone into. We will welcome that. I had a look at the Shadow Treasurer's press release, and the first page condemns the government for the deficit. Says the deficit's too high, they should have been tougher, etc. OK, if that's the line they're going to take, fair enough. The second page condemns our savings measures. Says we've saved too much. How dare we deal with the private health insurance rebate? How dare we deal with structural change to the budget deficit? Now, but the best bit, I have to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, comes towards the end. This is my personal favourite. I almost fell off my chair when I read this one, and I feel obliged to share it with the House, Madam Deputy Speaker. We come to education and training, and the Shadow Treasurer, the member for North Sydney, said this. Brace yourselves, this is good. He said, the government is offering nothing new for Australian schools at all. Now, I'm not sure where the Shadow Treasurer has been, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I seem to recall the government delivering the biggest rebuilding program of Australian schools in our history that they opposed. And now he comes in, issues a press release and says the government is offering nothing new for Australian schools at all. So having opposed the biggest rebuilding program, now the opposition's calling for us to do more. But it gets better. He then goes on to say universities have been let down. Universities have been let down by this government. From a member of the government that was the only government in the entire OECD to preside over a reduction in higher education funding, this government has delivered in this budget $5.7 billion over 4 years for higher education, and the Shadow Treasurer says universities have been let down. So presumably he would like to see more spending. So we call for a lower deficit, we oppose the spending cuts, and we call for more spending. I'm not quite sure how it works. He says universities have been let down. The chairman of the Group of 8, Professor Alan Robson, said, in a difficult budgetary environment, Ministers Carr and Gillard are to be commended for their long-term vision and commitment to Australian higher education. And close to home, Madam Deputy Speaker, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Western Sydney said, this has been a landmark federal budget for university teaching and research funding, one that promises to transform Australia's higher education landscape, said Professor Reid. So the Shadow Treasurer says universities have been let down. The universities don't agree. He calls for more, and yet they also call for a lower deficit and a lower debt. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, is it any wonder that all the evidence is the Australian people have lost all confidence in the economic management abilities of those opposite? Now, if the opposition were in charge, it's highly unlikely that we would have seen some of the endorsements of the budget that we saw last night. It's highly unlikely we would have seen Standard & Poor's saying, and I quote, the budget articulates a plan for fiscal consolidation as economic conditions recover. The successful delivery of this strategy of returning the operating position to surpluses over the cycle and maintaining lower debt will be consistent with maintaining the AAA rating of Australia. I wonder if that would have been the case if we had the voodoo economics of those opposite with their voodoo dolls saying, how do we do this? I know what we'll do. We'll lower the deficit, we'll spend more and we'll oppose savings measures. I wonder if we would have seen that sort of endorsement. I wonder why we saw that sort of endorsement. It's because we've seen the government dealing with the long-term pressures on the Australian budget. The long-term pressures of demography, not only the global financial crisis but the ageing of the Australian population, the pressures that will place on the Australian budget in years to come. It's been said that demography is destiny by many people. It's been said by the Leader of the Opposition. He said it in his first speech. I remember it well. It was the same day as my first speech. And he said this, the demographic storm is coming. How it blows and whether our children will weather it will depend in large measure on the decisions we take today. Well said. It was a good contribution. It was a good first speech. I was sitting on the opposition side listening to it. And that's why the decisions we've taken like dealing with the age pension, are so important. People are living longer. The proportion of the population that is ageing is growing rapidly. And unless we make decisions now about how to deal with the demographic storm, as the Leader of the Opposition calls it, then we'll be leaving it to our children and we'll be doing them a disservice, Madam Deputy Speaker. Policy decisions like dealing with the age pension and dealing with the private health insurance rebate. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, these are the sorts of decisions the government's had to make. Tough decisions. Decisions which weren't made lightly, decisions which weren't made with alacrity, decisions which were made over a long period of time in a careful and considered way. Tough decisions. Now, the opposition says they're not tough decisions, but they're not sure if they're tough enough to support them. That's what they say. You haven't made any tough decisions, but the decisions you've taken are too tough for us to support. That seems to be the other confused narrative we get from the Leader of the Opposition. Well, budget time's not just a test for governments, Madam Deputy Speaker. As much as it is a test for governments, it's also a test for oppositions. And tomorrow night will be a test for this Leader of the Opposition. Last year it was a test for the member for Bradfield. A test he failed and he paid the price, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tomorrow night will be a test as to whether the Leader of the Opposition can live up to his title. Is he a leader or is he an opportunist? It will be a test as to whether he's someone willing to act or just willing to whinge. It will be a test as to whether he's interested in the nation's interest or his own self-interest. It will be a test as to whether he is up to the job of Leader of the Opposition. The Australian people don't just look to the government for leadership in times like this, they also look to the parliament. The Leader of the Opposition has been strong on rhetoric about bipartisanship in the face of this crisis. He's been very good at the rhetoric. Well, tomorrow night he has the chance to come in here and lend some bipartisan support to this government's efforts to keep the economy strong, to provide stimulus to the economy and to put us in a sound structural footing going forward. It's a test that we'll wait and see if he can pass.